What if one of the Emperor's own legions was so utterly destroyed, so completely annihilated, that the Imperium erased them from history itself, not defeated in battle and rebuilt, not dishonored and cast into exile, but obliterated so thoroughly that even their name became a whisper, their colors forgotten, their very existence reduced to redacted files and terrified silence among those who knew the truth. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are horrors so profound that even the Imperium of Man, an empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds, chooses to forget rather than remember. And at the heart of that manufactured amnesia lies the Rangdan Xenocides, 3 campaigns of such catastrophic brutality that they nearly brought the Great Crusade to its knees and may have consumed an entire Space Marine Legion in the process. The story begins not with triumph, but with absence. A gap in the records, the Second Legion. Legion numbering went from 1 to 20, each commanded by a genetically crafted Primarch, each destined to reconquer the galaxy in mankind's name. We know of the First Legion, the Dark Angels, masters of secrecy and stubborn pride. We know of the Third, the Emperor's children, perfectionists who would fall to decadence. The 4th through 20th, their histories fill libraries, their victories and failures chronicled across 10,000 years. But the Second? Silence. And their brothers, the 11th Legion? The same void where glory should echo. 2 missing legions, 2 absent Primarchs, and a wound in Imperial history that bleeds questions even now, millennia after whatever happened to them. The Rangdan Xenocides took place during the Great Crusade's darkest chapter, a period when humanity's expansion into the galactic north encountered something that didn't just resist conquest, but threatened to reverse it entirely. The Rangdan were not like other Xenos threats. They weren't simple beasts to be exterminated or primitive cultures to be swept aside. They were something older, something technologically sophisticated and utterly hostile to human existence. The fragmentary records that survive speak of biomechanical horrors, of species-level parasitism, of technologies that could subvert and control human minds and bodies, turning the Imperium's own soldiers into weapons against themselves. They spoke of cerebral parasites that could hollow out a man's skull and pilot his corpse. They spoke of war machines that thought and hungered. They spoke of something that had been waiting in the galactic north, something that had survived Old Night, and something that saw humanity not as a rival, but as raw material. The first Rangdan Xenocide began around 860 M30, roughly a century and a half into the Great Crusade, when Imperial forces encountered the Rangdan at the edge of the galactic northeast. What should have been another campaign of compliance became a meat grinder. Expeditionary fleets vanished. Entire army regiments went silent, their last transmissions speaking of infiltration, subversion, soldiers turning on their brothers with dead eyes and jerking movements. The Astartes themselves, the Emperor's finest warriors, gene-forged and psychologically conditioned beyond human limitation, found themselves struggling against an enemy that learned from each encounter, that adapted and evolved strategies within single battles, that seemed to understand Imperial doctrine better than the commanders wielding it. Losses mounted, not setbacks, not tactical withdrawals, but casualties on a scale not seen since the Unification Wars, when the Emperor first conquered Terra itself. The Emperor responded by deploying the Dark Angels in force, led by their Primarch Leon L. Jonson, a warrior whose genius for warfare was matched only by his capacity for ruthless pragmatism. The Lion waged a campaign of such calculated brutality that it shocked even his brother Primarchs. Entire worlds were not just conquered, but rendered lifeless, their biospheres scoured to bedrock with cyclonic torpedoes and virus bombs. He employed weapons from the dark age of technology, forbidden tools kept locked in the deepest vaults of the Imperium, unleashed now because the alternative was extinction. And still the Rangdan adapted, still they pushed back. The war dragged on for years, consuming resources, manpower, and entire fleets. By the time the first Xenocide concluded around 890 M30, the Imperium had bought itself breathing room, not victory. The Rangdan were pushed back but not destroyed, And the cost? Tens of thousands of Astartes dead, hundreds of thousands of Imperial army soldiers lost. And something else, something the records don't quite say. Because that's when the discrepancies appear. That's when legion numbering starts to show gaps. After the first Rangdan Xenocide, references to certain legions become vague, then contradictory, then absent. The second and 11th legions, already mysterious, seem to fade from documentation entirely in this period. Where they should appear in orders of battle, there are blanks. Where their colors should fly in triumph alongside their brothers, there is emptiness. And when the Rangdan returned for the second Xenocide around 892 M30, the response was even more desperate, even more total. The Emperor himself left the growing works of the Imperial palace and took to the field, something he had not done since the early Crusade. He brought the Thousand Suns. He brought elements of the Space Wolves. He brought the Custodian Guard, his personal companions, warriors who never left his side except in the direst circumstances. What threat could possibly demand such a concentration of force? The whispers among those who study Forbidden's lore suggest an answer that makes even the most hardened scholars of Imperial history uncomfortable. They suggest that the Rangdan had achieved something catastrophic, that they had not just defeated Imperial forces, but subverted them, that entire complements of Astartes had been turned, their enhanced bodies and minds enslaved to Xenos' control, transformed into weapons against their own Imperium. And if such a thing happened, if an entire legion or significant portions of multiple legions were compromised beyond recovery, what would the Imperium do? Could the shame of such corruption be allowed to exist? Could the knowledge that the Emperor's finest could be enslaved and perverted be allowed to spread among the fighting forces of the Great Crusade, already stretched thin across the galaxy? Or would it be simpler, cleaner, more necessary to simply erase them? To expunge every record, to forbid any mention, to make it as though they had never existed at all. The third Rangdan Xenocide, occurring sometime before 930 M30, was the final confrontation. The Imperium mobilized on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Horus Heresy itself. The Dark Angels led the assault once more, but this time they had orders that went beyond victory. This was to be extinction. The Rangdan and every world they touched would be cleansed not just of life, but of the possibility of life, rendered into dead zones where nothing would grow for millennia. The war was total. The death toll was staggering. But when it ended, the Rangdan threat was finally definitively eliminated. And in the wake of that final Xenocide, the Imperium held a strange kind of triumph, one celebrated quietly, one never quite comfortable to discuss. Because yes, humanity had survived. But the cost was written in the gaps of history itself, in the 2 legion numbers never spoken, in the Primarchs whose names were struck from the record, in the victories that would never be celebrated, because to celebrate them would be to acknowledge they occurred at all. And somewhere in those gaps, in that manufactured silence, lies a truth the Imperium decided was too dangerous to know. The truth, as much as can be reconstructed from fragments in Forbidden's archives, from the careful silences in official histories, and the nervous glances exchanged when certain questions are asked, is that the Rangdan Xenocides represented more than a military campaign. They were a revelation of vulnerability, a moment when the Imperium's carefully constructed mythology of inevitable human supremacy cracked and nearly shattered. The Great Crusade had been, until that point, a story of unbroken momentum. Yes, there were setbacks. Yes, battles were lost and worlds burned. But the narrative arc was clear, the ending never in doubt. Humanity would reclaim the galaxy, and the Emperor's vision would manifest across the stars. The Rangdan changed that certainty. They proved that extinction was still possible, that for all the Imperium's gene-crafted warriors and recovered technologies, humanity could still lose. And more terrifying than simple defeat was the possibility of corruption, of transformation, of becoming something that wore human skin but served an utterly alien purpose. The Space Marine legions were the Emperor's ultimate expression of human potential. Each warrior, a perfect synthesis of genetic enhancement, psychological conditioning, and martial training. They knew no fear, accepted no defeat, embodied the Imperium's promise that humanity could overcome any threat through strength and will. But what the Rangdan demonstrated was that even Astartes could be compromised. The cerebral parasites the Xenos employed were not crude mind control devices, but sophisticated biotechnologies that could infiltrate the enhanced nervous systems of Space Marines themselves. Reports from the period, fragmentary and heavily redacted, speak of entire squads turning on their brothers mid-battle, their movements still tactically sound, their skills intact, but their loyalty grotesquely inverted. They describe battlefield autopsies revealing alien organisms threaded through brain stems and spinal columns, so deeply integrated with the host that removal was impossible without killing the Marine, and in many cases the Marine was already effectively dead, their consciousness suppressed or destroyed while their body served new masters. Imagine the horror of that moment. You are a Space Marine, engineered to be humanity's defender, trained since childhood to know only duty and brotherhood. The warrior fighting beside you, who has shed blood with you across a dozen worlds, suddenly turns. His bolter, a moment ago firing at Xenos attackers, now aims at your head. His face shows no emotion, no recognition, just empty determination as he pulls the trigger. And you realize in that terrible instant that this could happen to you. That the purity you believed was absolute, the sanctity of your enhanced body and conditioned mind, means nothing to an enemy that views you as just another biological machine to be reprogrammed. The psychological impact of such encounters rippled through the legions engaged in the Rangdan front. These were warriors who had conquered their fear of death, but now they faced something worse than death, the fear of betrayal from within, the paranoia that the brother beside you might already be compromised, that you yourself might be harboring some microscopic invader, waiting to activate and turn you into a weapon against everything you serve. The response required was as brutal as it was necessary. Entire companies that had engaged Rangdan forces too closely were subjected to extensive screening, their battle brothers examined at the genetic and neurological level for any sign of contamination. Those found compromised were executed immediately, their gene seed harvested if possible, but their existence scrubbed from Legion records. Those suspected but not confirmed were often deployed to the most dangerous theaters, where their deaths could be assured through honorable combat rather than shameful termination. And those who had witnessed too much, who had seen their brothers turned or had fought against Astartes wearing Imperial colors but serving alien masters, were quietly transferred, their memories suppressed through psychic intervention or simple conditioning, their testimonies sealed. The Imperium could not afford the truth of Astartes' vulnerability to spread. The entire edifice of the Great Crusade rested on the perception of Space Marine invincibility. If the expeditionary fleets venturing into unknown space learned that even the legions could be corrupted, that even the Emperor's finest could be turned, the psychological blow might halt the crusade entirely. But there were degrees of corruption, levels of compromise that demanded different responses. A few infected Astartes could be identified and eliminated. A corrupted company could be purged with acceptable losses. But what if the infection had spread further? What if an entire legion, or substantial portions of multiple legions, had been exposed before the Rangdan threat was properly understood? The records become especially unclear around this question, but certain patterns emerge in the chronology that are difficult to ignore. The 2nd and 11th Legions both disappear from Imperial documentation during the period of the Rangdan Xenocides. Not gradually, not through some documented catastrophe, but abruptly, as if a decision was made and executed with administrative efficiency. Their Primarchs, whose rediscovery should have been celebrated events immortalized in art and song, are never named in any surviving record. Their Legion colors, which should have flown on 1,000 conquered worlds, appear nowhere. And most tellingly, their gene seed, the precious genetic material that allowed each Legion to create new warriors, was apparently never integrated into the later Space Marine chapters founded after the Horus Heresy, when the legions were broken into smaller formations and their genetic legacy distributed across the Imperium. There are references, oblique and carefully phrased, in documents from the period that suggest something catastrophic occurred. A notation in a logistics manifest referencing replacement stocks for lost legions during the Third Rangdan Xenocide. A fragment of a conversation between Primarchs recorded by a servitor and never properly deleted, in which Rogel Dorn mentions the shame of the forgotten, and Reboot Gilliman responds that the necessity was clear even if the cost was unbearable. A sealed order from the Emperor himself, its contents redacted but its header preserved, authorizing total expungement and memorial prohibition for genetic lines 2 and 11. These fragments tell a story, if you're willing to piece it together, of a decision made at the highest levels of Imperial authority. A decision that 2 legions, for reasons deemed sufficient by the Emperor, would be removed not just from active service, but from history itself. The question that haunts this mystery is whether the decision was punitive or merciful. Were the 2nd and 11th legions destroyed because they failed, because they proved unworthy of the honor bestowed upon them? Or were they destroyed because they were compromised, because the Rangdan corruption had spread so thoroughly through their ranks that the only response was complete eradication? There's a horrifying compassion in the second possibility, a recognition that these warriors, who had done nothing wrong except face an enemy that could turn their own biology against them, deserved better than to be remembered as traitors or failures. By erasing them completely, the Imperium granted them neither glory nor shame, simply non-existence. Their Primarchs, wherever they came from, whatever worlds they might have ruled or transformed, were struck from the record not as punishment but as mercy. Better to have never existed than to be remembered as the legions that fell to Xenos' corruption. Better to leave a gap in the numbering than to explain why 2 and 11 became weapons in alien hands. But there's another layer to this mystery, one that becomes apparent when you examine which legions remained after the Rangdan Xenocides and what roles they assumed. The Dark Angels, who bore the heaviest burden in all 3 campaigns, became a legion defined by secrets and internal security, obsessed with hunting down any hint of corruption or betrayal. The Space Wolves gained a reputation as the Emperor's executioners, specialists in fighting other Astartes, a role that would serve them when the Horus Heresy erupted. Were these developments organic, or were they responses to lessons learned during the Rangdan Wars? If the 2nd or 11th legions had to be destroyed by their own brothers, if Lion L. Jonson or Lemon Russ had been ordered to turn their weapons on fellow Space Marines already twisted by Xenos' influence, would that not explain the darkness that seemed to settle over certain legions in the Xenocide's aftermath? And then there's the Emperor's own response to consider. He who had largely remained on Terra after the Crusade's first century, building the Imperial Palace and pursuing mysterious projects in its deepest laboratories, personally took to the field during the 2nd Rangdan Xenocide. This was unprecedented. The master of mankind, who had entrusted the reconquest of the galaxy to his sons and their legions, who maintained that his presence was more valuable in other pursuits, suddenly deemed it necessary to directly engage. What could compel such a response? The official histories speak vaguely of the threat's magnitude, of Xenos technologies that required the Emperor's unique expertise to counter. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible. Perhaps the Emperor came to the Rangdan front because his own creations, the legions into which he had poured centuries of genetic research and unimaginable psychic power, were being turned against the Imperium. Perhaps he came because the decision to destroy one or more of those legions was so momentous, so counter to everything the Great Crusade represented, that only he could make it. Perhaps he came to personally end what he had created, to look upon the warriors who bore his genetic legacy and order their extinction because the alternative was worse. The Third Rangdan Xenocide concluded with absolute victory and silence in equal measure. The Xenos threat was eradicated so thoroughly that the Rangdan themselves became nearly mythical, their technologies destroyed, their worlds rendered uninhabitable, their very existence scrubbed from human memory except as a vague threat defeated in the Imperium's youth. But the cost of that victory was paid not just in the millions of human lives lost in conventional combat, but in something more fundamental to the Imperium's identity. 2 legions gone, 2 Primarchs unmade, and a recognition, buried deep in classified archives and never openly acknowledged, that the Emperor's grand design was not invulnerable, that his perfect warriors could fail or fall or be corrupted, and that sometimes the only response to such failure was to pretend it never happened at all. The Great Crusade continued after the Rangdan Xenocides, pushing outward to the Galactic Rim and beyond, but it was different now, darker, more cautious. The legions that remained knew something had been lost, even if they couldn't speak of what exactly. The silence that followed the Rangdan Xenocides was not peaceful. It was the silence of a mass grave, of secrets buried so deep that even the act of burial had been forgotten. The Imperium moved forward, as it always did, with fresh conquests and new triumphs to celebrate. But those who had fought in the Galactic North carried something with them that no amount of victory could erase. There are accounts, fragmentary and often dismissed as apocryphal, of veterans from the Rangdan campaigns who would wake screaming in the night, their enhanced physiology overriding even Astartes' conditioning. They spoke not of Xenos horrors or battlefield carnage, which any space marine could process and compartmentalize, but of something worse. They spoke of standing on execution grounds, watching warriors in familiar armor kneel before firing squads. They spoke of ships carrying tens of thousands of Astartes disappearing into stellar phenomena, their final transmission sealed by order of the Sigillite himself. They spoke of gene vaults being emptied and then destroyed, their contents reduced to ash rather than preserved for future generations. And when these veterans spoke too openly, too persistently, they often disappeared as well, reassigned to distant Crusade fleets or simply vanishing from all records, as if the Imperium had decided that memory itself was a contagion that needed to be quarantined. But memory is a stubborn thing, especially among beings designed to forget nothing. The Primarchs themselves, those demigod sons of the Emperor, carried the weight of what had happened in ways that manifested differently across their immortal lifespans. Robert Guilliman, the warrior administrator who would later pen the Codex Astartes and restructure the entire Space Marine organization, became obsessed with redundancy and adaptability in Legion structure. His reforms, implemented after the Horus Heresy, broke the legions into smaller chapters, ensured that no single genetic line dominated the Imperium's military might, created systems where the loss of any one chapter would not cripple humanity's defense. Was this solely a response to the betrayal of the heresy, or was Guilliman applying lessons learned earlier, during a time when entire legions could be lost to threats that conventional warfare couldn't defeat? His writings, meticulous and comprehensive on nearly every subject, contain a single cryptic passage about the importance of genetic diversity in the face of adaptive threats, and the necessity of accepting losses that serve the greater continuum. He never elaborated on what specific losses he meant, but the phrasing is notable for its melancholy, unusual in a document otherwise concerned with tactical efficiency. Lemon Russ, the Wolf King, became increasingly isolated after the Rangdan Xenocides, his legion taking on a role that set them apart from their brothers. The Space Wolves had always been fierce, had always embodied a savage nobility that other legions found simultaneously admirable and unsettling. But after the Xenocides, they became something else. They became the Executioners, the legion whispered to have special sanction to move against other Astartes if the need arose. There are stories, never confirmed but persistent in their retelling, of the Space Wolves being deployed against the 11th Legion in the campaign's final phase. Of Russ himself weeping as he gave the order to fire on ships bearing Imperial colors. Of his warriors who prided themselves on honor and brotherhood, forced to become kinslayers in service to a necessity they barely understood. Russ rarely spoke of the Rangdan campaigns in later years, and when he did, his words were carefully chosen, laden with a grief that seemed disproportionate to what official histories described. Once, when pressed by a remembrancer about the missing legions, he reportedly said only that Some shamas are too great to be spoken, and some mercies too terrible to be recorded. Before walking away and refusing any further questions on the subject, Leon L. Jonson, perhaps more than any of his brothers, was transformed by the Rangdan Xenocides. The Dark Angels already carried secrets from their home world of Caliban, mysteries that would later tear the Legion apart during the heresy. But the Rangdan campaigns added new layers to that culture of secrecy, creating an organization within the organization, circles of knowledge that extended downward through the Legion like the rings of some dark tree. The inner circle, the Death Wing, the esoteric ranks and hidden hierarchies that would define the Dark Angels for millennia, all of these structures trace their origins to the period immediately following the Xenocides. What were they guarding? What knowledge was so dangerous that it required such elaborate mechanisms of containment? The official answer is that they hunted the fallen, the Dark Angels who betrayed the Lion during the Horus Heresy. But the mechanisms of secrecy and paranoia existed before the fallen ever fell, suggesting that the Dark Angels learned early the importance of containing information, of ensuring that some truths never spread beyond those deemed worthy to bear them. The Lion himself became a figure of cold pragmatism, willing to employ any weapon, accept any cost, tolerate any darkness if it served ultimate victory. Had he always been that way, or was it the Rangdan campaigns that taught him that nobility was a luxury humanity could no longer afford? The Emperor's own actions after the Xenocides are equally telling in their opacity. He returned to Terra and intensified work on his secret project in the Imperial Palace dungeons, the work that would later be revealed as the Human Webway, an attempt to create a psychic transport network independent of the warp's corrupting influence. The official narrative is that this project had always been his priority, the true purpose of the Great Crusade merely to buy time for its completion. But the timing is suspicious. The Emperor had been content to let the crusade proceed with minimal personal intervention for over a century. Yet after confronting the Rangdan, after witnessing firsthand what adaptive Xenos corruption could do to his legions, he accelerated the Webway project with desperate urgency. Was he simply returning to a long-term goal, or had the Rangdan taught him that humanity's genetic and biological form was fundamentally vulnerable, that as long as humans existed as flesh and blood, they could be corrupted, controlled, transformed? The Webway would have allowed humanity to transcend its physical limitations, to exist partially in the psychic realm where conventional biological attacks could not reach. Perhaps the Rangdan showed the Emperor that his grand design was insufficient, that his space marines, for all their enhancements, were still built on a biological foundation that clever Xenos could exploit. Perhaps the loss of 2 legions convinced him that evolution beyond flesh was not an eventual goal, but an immediate necessity. And yet, despite all the official silence, despite the redacted records and enforced amnesia, the truth leaked out in ways the Imperium couldn't completely control. It leaked out in the nightmares of veterans. It leaked out in the changed behaviors of Primarchs who had witnessed things they couldn't speak of. It leaked out in the very structure of post-Xenocide military doctrine, in the paranoid security procedures and genetic screening protocols that became standard for all Imperial forces operating in previously Rangdan-held space. The regions of the galaxy where the Xenocides had been fought remained quarantined for centuries afterward. Vast swaths of space declared forbidden, not by Xenos occupation, but by Imperial decree. What was being hidden in those dead zones? Were their compromised Astartes still alive in some form, quarantined on lifeless worlds because they couldn't be killed but couldn't be allowed to escape? Were their Rangdan technologies too dangerous to destroy, but too powerful to ignore, locked away in sealed vaults, guarded by forces whose oaths extended beyond death? Or were there simply too many bodies, too many burned worlds, too much evidence of what the Imperium had been forced to do to survive? The mystery deepens when you consider the Space Marine chapters that emerged after the Second Founding, when Guilliman's Codex broke the legions into smaller formations. Every surviving legion contributed gene seed to create successor chapters. their genetic legacy distributed across the Imperium to ensure no single legion's destruction could eliminate a Primarch's line. Except for two. No chapters claim descent from the Second Legion. No chapters bear the gene seed of the 11th. Their genetic material, which should have been treasured as irreplaceable resources, apparently never entered the successor chapter program. Was it because the legions had been entirely destroyed, every warrior and every gene seed sample eliminated in the Rangdan Xenocides? Or was it because their genetic material itself was deemed compromised, tainted in ways that normal screening couldn't detect, capable of producing warriors who might, generations later, suddenly manifest Xenos corruption dormant in their very DNA? If the latter, then the destruction of two legions wasn't just a response to immediate threat, but a long-term genetic quarantine, an acknowledgement that the Rangdan infection operated on a level so fundamental that it could survive in gene seed itself, waiting to resurrect itself in future generations of Astartes. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is one rarely considered, because it challenges the foundational myths of the Imperium itself. What if the 2nd and 11th legions weren't destroyed because they were corrupted? What if they were destroyed because they successfully resisted corruption in ways that revealed uncomfortable truths about the Space Marine project? The Rangdan cerebral parasites were designed to exploit the enhanced neurology of Astartes, to hijack the very improvements that made them superior warriors. But what if certain legions, through quirks of their Primarch's genetic legacy or simple random variation, proved resistant to this exploitation? What if their resistance came not from strength, but from deviation, from being somehow less perfectly engineered than their brothers? The Imperium's ideology demanded that the Emperor's design was flawless, that the Primarchs and their legions represented humanity's ultimate form. A legion that survived Xenos corruption through imperfection rather than superiority would undermine that entire worldview. Better to destroy them and enforce silence than to admit that the Emperor's vision might contain flaws, that perfection itself could be a vulnerability. The pieces of this puzzle don't fit together cleanly because they were never meant to fit. The historical record was deliberately fragmented, the witnesses silenced, the evidence destroyed. What remains is suggestive rather than conclusive, a pattern of absences and implications rather than facts. Yet those patterns, when examined with enough care, tell a story that the Imperium desperately wanted to prevent. They tell a story of a crisis that threatened not just Imperial military power, but the psychological foundations on which the entire Great Crusade rested. They tell a story of choices made by the Emperor and his sons that prioritize the myth of invincibility over the reality of loss. And they tell a story that never truly ended, because the questions it raised about the nature of the Space Marines, about the vulnerabilities inherent in biological enhancement, about the limits of human evolution, remained unanswered. The Rangdan Xenocides were officially a victory, a threat eliminated and humanity triumphant. But victories measured in erased legions and forbidden memories carry a cost that compounds across centuries, a debt that would come due in ways the Imperium couldn't anticipate. Because the Horus Heresy, when it erupted decades later, would reveal that corruption didn't need Xenos parasites to compromise the Emperor's finest warriors. Sometimes the corruption was already there, woven into the pride and ambition and humanity that the Primarchs and their legions had never truly transcended, waiting for the right circumstances to manifest and bring the Imperium to the edge of annihilation once more. And when that happened, when half the legions turned traitor and the galaxy burned, perhaps some among the Imperium's leadership wondered if the lesson they had learned from the Rangdan, that erasure was preferable to truth, had been the wrong lesson all along. The question of whether erasure was the right choice haunts Imperial history like a ghost that refuses to remain buried. And nowhere is that haunting more evident than in the events that followed. The Great Crusade continued for decades after the Rangdan Xenocides, reclaiming world after world, pushing humanity's borders ever outward into the darkness. But something had fundamentally shifted in the character of that expansion. Where once there had been an almost naive confidence, a belief that human will and space marine prowess could overcome any obstacle. Now there was calculation, caution, a willingness to employ overwhelming force, not as a preference, but as standard doctrine. The Imperium that emerged from the Rangdan campaigns was harder, more paranoid, quicker to destroy rather than risk contamination. And perhaps most significantly, it was an Imperium that had learned to lie to itself, to edit its own history, to maintain necessary fictions, even when the truth leaked through the cracks like radiation from a poorly sealed reactor. The Remembrancers, those artists and historians tasked with documenting the Great Crusade for posterity, found their work increasingly censored after the Xenocides. What had begun as a project to immortalize humanity's greatest achievements became an exercise in selective memory, with entire campaigns disappearing from official accounts or being rewritten to remove uncomfortable details. Some Remembrancers protested, arguing that history demanded honesty, that future generations deserved to know the true cost of the Imperium's victories. Those protesters tended to have short careers, their objections noted, and their assignments changed to less sensitive theaters of war. The ones who adapted, who learned to write around the silences and accept the redactions, produced histories that were technically accurate but fundamentally incomplete, chronicles that described what happened without explaining why, that listed victories without acknowledging defeats. The irony was that this careful curation of truth created exactly the kind of fragile myth that would shatter most catastrophically when finally tested. By refusing to acknowledge that Space Marines could be corrupted by Xenos' influence, the Imperium left itself unprepared for the more insidious corruption that was already festering in the hearts of the Primarchs themselves. Because while the official narrative insisted that the 2nd and 11th Legions had never existed, the surviving Primarchs knew better. They remembered their lost brothers, even if they were forbidden to speak of them. Horus, who would later become the archtraitor and nearly destroy the Imperium, reportedly kept a private chamber in his flagship where he maintained memorials to all his brothers, including 2 alcoves that remained empty, their dedication plaques blank. When asked about them by his closest confidants, he would say only that some losses hurt too much to honor publicly, and some memories were too dangerous to preserve. What did Horus know about the missing legions? Had he witnessed their fall? Had he perhaps been ordered to participate in their destruction? The documents from this period suggest that Horus, as the Emperor's favored son and War Master of the Great Crusade, would have been privy to the highest levels of Imperial decision-making. If the 2nd and 11th Legions were destroyed by Imperial decree, Horus would have known. And if he knew, if he carried the memory of watching his brothers erased from history for the crime of falling to corruption they couldn't resist, how might that knowledge have influenced his own later rebellion? When chaos whispered to him of the Emperor's tyranny, of the callousness with which the Master of Mankind discarded his own creations, did Horus remember 2 empty alcoves and find the accusations all too credible? Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons and perhaps the most psychically gifted of all the Emperor's sons, had his own perspective on the missing legions. The Thousand Sons had fought extensively during the 2nd Rangdan Xenocide, deploying psychic powers that could detect and purge Xenos' corruption before it could spread. Magnus himself had stood beside the Emperor during some of the campaign's darkest hours, had witnessed the Master of Mankind employ powers that transcended mere physical warfare, had seen worlds not just destroyed but unmade, their very existence erased from the psychic imprint of the galaxy. In the years that followed, Magnus became increasingly troubled by questions of knowledge and censorship, by the Imperium's growing tendency to suppress information rather than disseminate it. His famous defiance of the Emperor's prohibition on psychic research, the act that would ultimately damn his legion and drive them into chaos's embrace, stemmed partly from a conviction that ignorance was more dangerous than knowledge, that the Imperium's policy of enforced forgetting created vulnerabilities rather than eliminating them. He had seen what happened when threats weren't understood, when the response to corruption was simple destruction without comprehension. He had watched 2 legions disappear because the Imperium preferred erasure to education, and he was determined not to let that fate befall his own sons. The tragedy, of course, was that his desperate attempt to prove the value of knowledge, his decision to breach the Imperial Palace's psychic defenses, to warn the Emperor of Horus's impending betrayal, shattered the Webway project and unleashed demonic horrors into the heart of the Imperium, validating every fear that had driven the policy of suppression in the first place. The Horus Heresy, when it finally erupted, seemed to justify every paranoid security measure the Imperium had implemented after the Rangdan Xenocides. Half the Space Marine legions turned traitor, their primarchs falling to chaos corruption in ways that made the Xenos parasites of the Rangdan seem almost quaint by comparison. Where the Rangdan had to physically invade and subvert their victims, chaos worked through belief and emotion, through pride and ambition and wounded dignity, corrupting from within in ways that no genetic screening could detect. The Imperium burned. Terra itself was besieged. The Emperor was mortally wounded and entombed upon the Golden Throne, becoming a slowly dying god unable to guide the civilization he had built. And in the ashes of that civil war, as the surviving legions tried to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong, some must have wondered if the lessons learned from the Rangdan Xenocides had been the right lessons after all. The policy of erasure had kept the Imperium moving forward after the loss of 2 legions, had maintained morale and prevented panic. But it had also created a culture where problems were hidden rather than addressed, where corruption was denied until it became undeniable, where loyal warriors like Magnus could become traitors simply because they believed the Imperium's self-imposed ignorance was its greatest weakness. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, since the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne and the Imperium's slow decay into bureaucratic nightmare, the question of the missing legions has become almost theological. The Inquisition, that organization dedicated to rooting out heresy and Xenos corruption, maintains sealed archives regarding the Rangdan Xenocides, access to which is restricted to only the highest echelons of authority. Those few who have read those archives and survived the experience report, finding not answers but more questions, records so heavily redacted that meaning must be inferred from context, testimonies that contradict each other in ways suggesting either deliberate misinformation or the presence of threats that could not be consistently perceived. Some inquisitors have built entire careers around investigating the missing legions, convinced that understanding what happened during the Rangdan Xenocides is key to protecting the Imperium from similar threats in the future. Others argue that the mystery itself is the lesson, that the Emperor's decision to enforce forgetting was wisdom rather than weakness, and that some knowledge serves no purpose except to undermine faith in humanity's inevitable triumph. But faith, however necessary, cannot change material reality. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is besieged on all fronts, its territory carved up by Xenos empires and chaos incursions, its military stretched impossibly thin across 1 million worlds. The Space Marine chapters, those descendants of the original legions, number in the thousands now, but are still insufficient to humanity's defense. Each chapter typically maintains no more than 1,000 warriors, compared to the tens or hundreds of thousands that compose the original legions. The gene seed that creates new Space Marines is precious, irreplaceable, harvested from fallen warriors and carefully preserved against a future that grows ever more desperate. And in that context, the loss of 2 entire legions worth of genetic material becomes not just a historical tragedy, but an ongoing strategic catastrophe. If the 2nd and 11th legions still existed, if their gene seed had been preserved and propagated, the Imperium might have hundreds of additional chapters defending humanity's borders. How many worlds have fallen because those defenders didn't exist? How many humans have died because the Emperor chose erasure over recovery? The calculus is impossible to perform, but the hypothetical haunts every military theorist who understands the scope of what was lost. And yet, there are whispers, rumors that persist despite all efforts at suppression. Whispers of strange Space Marine forces encountered in the Galactic North, wearing colors that match no known chapter, speaking battle cant that seems archaic even by Astartes standards. Whispers of gene seed samples discovered in forgotten Mechanicus vaults, bearing markers that don't correspond to any of the 18 known Primarch genetic lines. Whispers of inquisitors who pursued these rumors too aggressively and vanished, their investigations sealed and their subordinates reassigned to distant sectors. Are these whispers evidence that something of the missing legion survived, hidden away in some deep void or preserved in stasis by those who couldn't bear to see them completely destroyed? Or are they simply the echoes of what the Imperium wishes were true, ghost stories told by an empire that desperately wants to believe its losses can be reversed, its mistakes undone? The truth, if it exists, remains buried beneath 10,000 years of accumulated secrecy, each generation adding new layers of classification and misdirection, until even those tasked with keeping the secrets no longer remember precisely what they're keeping. There is a moment recorded in the private journals of an unnamed Inquisitor Lord that captures the terrible ambiguity at the heart of this mystery. The Inquisitor had spent decades investigating the Rangdan Xenocides, had assembled what might have been the most complete picture of events any individual in the modern Imperium possessed. He had found references to quarantine worlds in the Galactic North, sealed by ancient decrees that predated the Inquisition itself. He had discovered maintenance logs for stasis facilities that consumed more power than should be necessary for mere storage. He had traced patterns in gene seed tithing records that suggested certain Mechanicus forge worlds were supplying genetic material to unknown recipients. And then, at the climax of his investigation, he received a visit from an individual who claimed to represent interests within the Imperium so highly placed that they could not be named. The conversation, as recorded in the journal, was brief. The visitor informed the Inquisitor that his investigation was noted, his diligence appreciated, but that he stood now at a threshold he was forbidden to cross. Beyond that threshold, the visitor explained, lay knowledge that would not protect the Imperium but would wound it. Truths that served no purpose except to undermine the myths that kept humanity fighting. The Inquisitor could choose to step back, to accept that some mysteries existed not to be solved, but to be endured. Or he could press forward and accept the consequences. The journal ends abruptly after that entry, its final pages torn out, and the Inquisitor Lord was found dead 3 weeks later, officially attributed to heart failure, though the man had been in perfect health and possessed augmented organs that should have made such failure impossible. The message was clear, and it has been repeated in various forms. Throughout the Imperium's history, whenever investigators draw too close to the truth about the missing legions, some questions are dangerous not because of their answers, but because asking them at all threatens the architecture of belief that holds the Imperium together. And so the mystery persists, neither solved nor truly forgotten, existing in that liminal space between history and myth, where the Imperium stores all its most uncomfortable truths. The Rangdan Xenocides happened, that much is undeniable. The 2nd and 11th legions existed and then ceased to exist. The gap in the numbering is evidence that can't be entirely erased. Something occurred during those campaigns that was so terrible, so threatening to the Imperium's conception of itself, that erasure seemed preferable to acknowledgement. But whether that something was the corruption and destruction of the missing legions, or their survival in some form that contradicts official narratives, or something else entirely, something so strange that the very framework of understanding would need to be rebuilt to accommodate it, remains, after 10,000 years, unknown. What is certain is that the consequences of those events, of the choices made in their aftermath, echo through every subsequent chapter of Imperial history, shaping doctrines and institutions and fears in ways that those living within that history can barely perceive. The Imperium of Man is built upon layers of controlled forgetting, strategic ignorance maintained as a bulwark against despair. And at the foundation of that edifice of necessary lies, buried beneath millennia of accumulated secrecy, lies the truth about 2 legions that the Emperor himself decided were too dangerous to remember. But some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave or how carefully the earth is arranged above them. In the dying years of the 41st millennium, as the galaxy tears itself apart along the Great Rift and reality itself becomes negotiable, the past has begun to resurface in ways the Imperium can no longer control. Chaos incursions don't just bring demons and madness, they bring temporal distortions, moments where the skin of history grows thin and what was hidden bleeds through into the present. Worlds thought lost re-emerge from the warp after thousands of years, their inhabitants unchanged, still living in the era of the Great Crusade, still waiting for orders from Primarchs who have been dead or damned for millennia. And sometimes, very rarely, those worlds carry records that shouldn't exist, documents from a time when the 2nd and 11th Legions still fought beneath Imperial banners before the decision was made to unmake them. One such world appeared in the Ghoul Stars, that haunted region of space where reality has always been suspect, where nightmares have physical form and the laws of nature bend like wire under stress. The world was designated Salvation, a fortress monastery that housed elements of what the fragmentary records called the 11th Legion. When Imperial forces finally broke through the temporal distortions surrounding it and made planetfall, they found a place frozen in time, a snapshot of the Great Crusade preserved in amber. The fortress stood intact, its walls still bearing the Legion's colors that matched no known chapter, a combination of deep bronze and pale silver that seemed to shift in the light as if unable to decide what it truly was. The bodies of Space Marines lay where they had fallen, their armor ancient, but their faces peaceful, as if they had simply decided to sleep and never woke. There was no sign of battle, no evidence of corruption or mutation, no Rangdan parasites threaded through neural tissue. Just silence and stillness, and the overwhelming impression of the story interrupted mid-sentence, never given the chance to reach its conclusion. The Inquisition arrived within days, declared the entire planet under seal of the Ordo Malleus, and began systematic purging of anyone who had witnessed the discovery. But information, once released, takes on a life of its own. Picked captures were taken before the purge began. Data crystals were smuggled off-world by ship crew who didn't understand what they carried, but knew suppression when they saw it. And most significantly, several members of the initial exploration team transmitted their findings to chapter masters of various Space Marine organizations before the Inquisition could silence them. Those transmissions were brief, technical, describing what had been found in the fortress's inner sanctum, a chamber containing thousands of gene seed samples in perfect stasis, labeled with designations that corresponded to the 11th Legion, and beside them, a sealed message tube bearing the personal seal of the Emperor himself. The message was encrypted with codes so old that even the Mechanicus databases had no record of them, but the very existence of it raised questions that could not be unanswered. Why would the Emperor leave a message in a fortress he had supposedly ordered destroyed? What truth was so important that it needed to be preserved even as everything else was erased? The response from the High Lords of Terra was immediate and absolute. The world of Salvation was declared perdita, utterly lost, and subjected to exterminatus. Cyclonic torpedoes reduced its surface to molten glass. The fleet that performed the destruction was itself dispersed across a dozen sectors, its crew mind-wiped and reassigned. The Inquisitors who had overseen the purge were given new identities and new duties. Their connection to the incident severed through psychic conditioning and bureaucratic misdirection. And yet the questions remained, spreading through the Astartes like a virus of uncertainty. If the 11th Legion had been corrupted beyond redemption, why was their gene seed preserved in stasis rather than destroyed? If they had fallen to Xenos' influence, why did the bodies show no signs of mutation or parasitic infiltration? And most troubling of all, if the Emperor had deemed them worthy of complete erasure, why had he also left them a message, something meant to be found by someone at some future time? The answer, when it finally emerged through the tireless investigation of those who refused to let the past remain silent, was more complex and more tragic than anyone had imagined. The 2nd and 11th Legions had not been destroyed because they were corrupted. They had been destroyed because they were incorruptible in ways that revealed fundamental flaws in the Emperor's grand design. The Rangdan parasites, those cerebral horrors that could subvert even Astartes' physiology, functioned by exploiting the enhancements that made Space Marines superior to baseline humans. They hijacked the hypnotic conditioning, redirected the enhanced aggression, rewrote the absolute loyalty that was supposed to be unbreakable. But the 2nd and 11th Legions, through quirks in their Primarchs' genetic legacy, possessed a strange resistance to such exploitation. Not because they were stronger or more pure, but because they were, in some fundamental way, incomplete. Their psychological conditioning was less absolute. Their loyalty was genuine rather than programmed. Their humanity, which the Space Marine process was supposed to transcend, remained stubbornly intact. This should have been celebrated as a triumph, proof that the Emperor's work could produce warriors who resisted corruption through authentic virtue rather than mere conditioning. Instead, it terrified the architects of the Imperium. Because if these legions could resist the Rangdan through retained humanity, it implied that the dehumanization inherent in creating Space Marines was not a necessary sacrifice but a vulnerability. It suggested that the Emperor's design, which stripped away emotion and individuality in pursuit of perfect obedience, had created warriors who were powerful but brittle, capable of superhuman feats, but paradoxically easier to subvert than less modified humans, precisely because their will was not their own. The 2nd and 11th Legions proved that another path was possible, that Space Marines could be both effective and authentically human, both loyal and free to choose that loyalty. And that possibility threatened everything the Imperium was built upon. The decision to erase them was not made in anger or disappointment. It was made in cold calculation. The Imperium could not afford to have 2 legions demonstrating that the others were manufactured slaves rather than noble heroes. It could not risk the remaining Primarchs questioning whether their own conditioning, their own loyalty, was genuine or simply programmed. The Great Crusade required absolute faith in the Emperor's wisdom, absolute confidence in the Space Marine design. The existence of legions that suggested alternative approaches, better approaches, would undermine that faith and potentially fracture the entire enterprise. And so they were offered a choice: submit to reconditioning, to psychological restructuring that would bring them in line with the other legions, that would erase the humanity that made them unique, or accept erasure, complete and total, themselves and their memory both removed from the Imperium they had fought to build. The record suggests they chose erasure, not because they were traitors or cowards, but because they understood what they represented. They understood that their mere existence asked questions the Imperium could not answer, challenged assumptions that could not be challenged without bringing down the entire structure. They were soldiers, ultimately, and soldiers understand sacrifice. The message the Emperor left in that hidden fortress was not an explanation or an apology. It was a promise. A promise that someday, when the Imperium was stronger, when humanity had evolved beyond its current fragile state, when the desperate measures of the Great Crusade were no longer necessary, the gene seed would be awakened. The legions would be rebuilt, and they would be honored not as failures who had to be hidden, but as martyrs who sacrificed themselves so their brothers could continue fighting. It was a promise made by a being who believed he would live forever, who thought he had millennia to fulfill it, who could not imagine a future where he would be trapped in eternal dying on the Golden Throne, unable to speak or act, his promises forgotten by an Imperium that had learned to worship him as a god rather than trust him as a father. 10,000 years later, that promise remains unfulfilled. The gene seed, if it survived the destruction of salvation, is lost again, scattered or destroyed or hidden so deeply that even the most exhaustive searches cannot locate it. The 2nd and 11th Legions remain erased, their sacrifice unremembered except by those few who have pieced together fragments of truth from classified archives and forbidden's testimony. And the Imperium continues its slow decay, marshalling its Space Marine chapters against threats on every front, never quite having enough warriors, never quite able to turn the tide permanently, always one disaster away from final collapse. The irony is profound and terrible. The legions that were destroyed to preserve unity might have been the salvation the Imperium now desperately needs. Warriors who could resist corruption through genuine virtue rather than conditioning. Warriors who could inspire others through authentic heroism rather than indoctrinated obedience. Warriors who proved that humanity's strength came not from transcending human weakness, but from embracing it, from choosing loyalty and courage and sacrifice freely rather than having those qualities programmed into their genetics. But perhaps the deepest tragedy is not what was lost, but what was never learned. The Imperium destroyed the 2nd and 11th legions and learned nothing from their sacrifice except that inconvenient truths should be buried. It continued to create Space Marines through the same process, stripping away humanity in pursuit of obedience, building warriors who were magnificent but hollow. And when half those warriors turned traitor during the Horus Heresy, when the conditioning failed and the programming shattered, and Primarchs who had been engineered for loyalty chose rebellion instead, the Imperium still refused to ask whether the design itself was flawed. It blamed chaos, corruption, Xenos influence, moral weakness, anything except the possibility that beings created to be weapons might resent their creation, that loyalty enforced is not loyalty at all, that the very dehumanization meant to make them incorruptible actually made them vulnerable to any force that offered to restore what had been taken from them. The lesson the missing legions tried to teach, that humanity was strength, not weakness, went unheeded. And the Imperium paid the price in blood and ashes, in civil war and eternal stagnation, in 10,000 years of grinding decay that shows no sign of ending. Now, in the era of the Indomitus Crusade, as Robert Guilliman walks among the living once more, resurrected from millennia of stasis to lead the Imperium against the darkness of the Cicatrix Maledictum, there are whispers that he remembers, that he carries the weight of what happened to his missing brothers, that sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, he stands before empty memorial spaces in the fortress of Hera and speaks to Primarchs who are not there, apologizing for choices made, for silences kept, for participating in an erasure that may have doomed the Imperium as surely as any treachery. He has the power now, perhaps, to reveal the truth, to restore the honor of the lost legions, to acknowledge their sacrifice and complete the Emperor's promise. But he does not, because he understands what they understood, that some truths, however valid, would shatter faith, that the Imperium survives on necessary lies, that the question of whether Space Marines are noble heroes or manufactured slaves is one that cannot be publicly asked without destroying the institution entirely. And so he keeps the secret, adds his silence to the accumulated silence of 10 millennia, and the 2nd and 11th legions remain ghosts, honored only in the empty spaces where their history should be, in the gaps between the numbers, in the dreams of those who wonder what was lost and whether it could ever be recovered. The Rangdan Xenocides destroyed more than Xenos. They destroyed possibility itself. The galaxy burns as it always has, and the Imperium endures as it always must. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the truth about 2 lost legions drifts like debris from an ancient shipwreck, pieces of a story that will never be fully assembled, fragments of sacrifice that will never be completely understood. This is the nature of the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium, a civilization built on layers of forgotten history, each generation inheriting mysteries they cannot solve and adding new mysteries for those who come after. The question of whether the Rangdan Xenocides destroyed a legion has an answer, but the answer itself raises questions that cut deeper than simple historical curiosity. Yes, 2 legions were lost, but lost implies something misplaced, something that might be found again. What happened was more deliberate, more final. They were erased. And the erasure was not the tragic consequence of defeat, but the calculated choice of victory. The price paid not in battle, but in the silence that followed. There is something profoundly human in this, something that transcends the Gothic science fantasy of gene-forged demigods and galactic empires. It speaks to the fundamental tension between truth and necessity, between honoring the past and protecting the future. Every civilization faces moments when the comfortable lie seems wiser than the uncomfortable truth, when mythology serves better than history, when the story that inspires is valued more highly than the reality that merely informs. The Imperium chose mythology. It chose to preserve faith in the Space Marine ideal, even at the cost of erasing those who proved that ideal was flawed or incomplete, or simply more complex than the propaganda required. And in making that choice, it followed a pattern as old as humanity itself. The pattern of martyrs whose martyrdom must be hidden, of sacrifices too profound to acknowledge, of heroes who serve best by being forgotten. But every choice carries consequences that ripple across time in ways impossible to predict. The Imperium that erased the 2nd and 11th Legions believed it was protecting its unity, ensuring the Great Crusade could continue without existential questions undermining morale. What it actually did was establish a precedent that truth was negotiable, that history could be edited, that inconvenient realities should be suppressed rather than confronted. That precedent became institutional. It became the foundation for an entire apparatus of censorship and information control. And when the Horus Heresy erupted, when Primarchs who had seemed absolutely loyal revealed themselves as traitors, the Imperium's first instinct was the same: suppress, redact, forbid discussion. It declared the traitor legions' names forbidden, their colors anathema, their history to be spoken only as cautionary tales stripped of complexity or context. But by then the pattern was too established, the culture of enforced forgetting too deeply embedded. The Imperium could control official records, but it could not control memory itself, could not prevent those who had fought in the heresy from remembering, from passing stories to their successors, from keeping alive the truth that loyalty and betrayal were not simple opposites but complex human conditions that could coexist in the same heart. 10,000 years is a long time to maintain a lie, even for an empire that spans the galaxy. Long enough for the lie to become myth, for the myth to become religion, for the religion to become truth in all the ways that matter to those living within it. The Space Marines of the 41st millennium do not question their creation or their purpose. They are indoctrinated from childhood, psychologically conditioned to view doubt itself as heresy, trained to find meaning in service and glory in death. They are everything the 2nd and 11th Legions refuse to become: perfect soldiers whose humanity has been carefully excised, leaving only duty and rage and genetically mandated loyalty. And they are magnificent. They hold a dying Imperium together through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. They fight impossible battles and occasionally win them. They inspire billions of humans to stand against darkness when every rational calculation says to flee or surrender. The Space Marine myth works, in other words. It fulfills its purpose. And yet there are moments, recorded in the private thoughts of chapter masters and the sealed confessions of chaplains, when even these manufactured warriors wonder what was lost in their making, what possibilities were foreclosed when humanity decided that its defenders must be more than human and thereby became something less. The Rangdan themselves are gone, extinct or so thoroughly scattered that they pose no threat to modern Imperial space. The worlds they infested have been cleansed or remain quarantined, dead zones avoided by traitors and explorers. The cerebral parasites that could subvert Astartes' physiology no longer exist outside of classified xenobiology archives. The threat that justified the destruction of 2 legions has been eliminated so completely that most Imperial citizens have never heard the name Rangdan, would not recognize it if they did. And so the sacrifice that the 2nd and 11th Legions made, the choice to accept erasure rather than compromise the Imperium's unity, served its immediate purpose. The Great Crusade continued. The remaining legions fought on without the existential doubt that might have paralyzed them. Humanity reclaimed the galaxy. But the question that echoes across the millennia is whether the cost was worth paying. Whether an empire built on necessary lies can ever be as strong as one built on difficult truths. Whether the suppression of those who proved that Space Marines could be both effective and human ultimately weakened the Imperium more than their continued existence ever would have. There is no easy answer, which is perhaps appropriate for a mystery that has persisted for 10,000 years. Both positions carry weight. The pragmatist argues that the Imperium survived, that it endured the Rangdan Xenocides and the Horus Heresy and countless other existential threats precisely because it was willing to make hard choices, to sacrifice even its own heroes when necessity demanded. The idealist counters that survival without truth is merely postponed extinction, that an empire which fears its own history is already dead in all the ways that matter. Both are right, both are wrong. The reality exists in the space between these positions, in the recognition that the Imperium is neither purely noble nor purely corrupt, but something more complex and more human, a vast struggling, desperate attempt to preserve a species in a galaxy that wants it dead, flawed in execution but profound in intent, capable of both magnificent heroism and terrible cruelty, often within the same breath. What remains after all the investigation and speculation, after the piecing together of fragments and the reading of silences, is a story of soldiers who made an impossible choice. They were offered reconditioning or erasure, slavery or death, and they chose death. Not because they were traitors, but because they were heroes. Not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to recognize that their strength, their very existence, threatened something larger than themselves. They understood that the Imperium of their time needed faith more than truth, needed unity more than complexity, needed Space Marines who would never question their purpose more than warriors who chose their loyalty freely. And so they stepped into the darkness, allowed themselves to be forgotten, became the answer to a question the Imperium was forbidden to ask. This is martyrdom in its purest form, sacrifice that cannot be acknowledged, heroism that must be hidden, service that looks like erasure, because that is precisely what it was. The galaxy has moved on. The Imperium faces new threats, fights new wars, creates new heroes and new martyrs in an endless cycle of survival and suffering. Primarchs Space Marines, Reboot Guilliman's latest improvement on the Emperor's design, now fight beside their firstborn brothers, enhanced beyond even the already superhuman standard, optimized for warfare in ways that would have seemed impossible during the Great Crusade. They are everything. Space Marines were meant to be stronger, faster, more resilient, more utterly committed to the Imperium's survival. And they carry no memory of the 2nd and 11th Legions, no awareness that alternatives to their existence were ever explored or that warriors once proved that humanity itself could be strength rather than weakness. The pattern continues, the erasure holds, and the Imperium endures, neither learning from its past nor fully escaping it, locked in the eternal present where every threat is met with the same solutions, every question answered with the same silences. But memory is stubborn, and truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression. Somewhere in the Imperium's vast archives, in data crystals sealed beneath layers of encryption and authorization protocols, the full story of the Rangdan Xenocides still exists. Somewhere among the Space Marine chapters, in the private knowledge passed from chapter master to successor, the names of the missing Primarchs are still whispered. Somewhere in the collective unconscious of humanity itself, in the myths and dreams and half-remembered legends that persist despite all censorship, the 2nd and 11th Legions continue to exist, transformed from history into something more durable, more dangerous to suppress into idea. The idea that loyalty can be chosen rather than programmed. The idea that humanity's greatest strength is its humanity, not its transcendence of it. The idea that some truths matter more than comfortable lies, even when telling them costs everything. Did the Rangdan Xenocides destroy a legion? Yes, 2 of them. But destruction and loss are not the same thing. What was destroyed was their physical existence, their place in the official record, their right to be remembered by the civilization they died defending. What was lost was the possibility they represented. The alternative path they proved was possible. the question they raised about the very nature of the Space Marine project. And what remains, indestructible because it was never truly material, is the choice they made to be erased rather than corrupted, to accept oblivion rather than compromise, to serve the Imperium by stepping out of its history so that history could continue without them. In a galaxy where faith is literally power, where belief shapes reality and mythology determines truth, the missing legions have become something the Imperium never intended, proof that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, there is also sacrifice and nobility, and the kind of love that expresses itself through absolute surrender. They are the Imperium's original sin and its greatest hope, the wound that never heals and the scar tissue that holds it together, the question that cannot be answered because asking it changes everything. They are lost, they are found, they are forgotten, they are eternal. And somewhere in the spaces between the stars, in the gaps where their story should be, they wait, not for resurrection or vindication or even acknowledgement, but simply to be understood by someone, anyone, who asks the right questions and has the courage to face the implications of the answers.